The best thing I think for you would be, in case you felt like taking notes, would be to have your sketchbook and pencil, and otherwise, no. So I'll just kind of wait till people settle down a bit and get comfortable.
Daniel, can I fix you a cup of coffee?
Sure, thanks.
Okay. And here's your herb tea.
So when Callie asked me to talk to you about something to do with plein air art, my thought was to talk about something that would be inspiring, and also to maybe just talk about where plein air art came from, where plein air landscape painting came from, and how we got to it and where it's gone. Just to kind of get people enthusiastic, I hope. I have a talk, and I'm calling it The Brief History of the Landscape Painting Genre, but it could have a subtitle that could be, Where Did It Come From and Who Paid for It? Because that's a big part of art history. So I wanted to ask some questions. I'm actually giving the answer here. What was the first landscape painting? The very first ever. So does anybody know? No? Okay.
Well, I can see the answer, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, but that would be like being the A student.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to take a step back for a minute, and I'm going to ask you, what are the earliest paintings?
On the caves of France. Yeah.
Hieroglyphics? Okay.
Yeah, the caves in France.
The cave
paintings.
paintings, right? They're probably the very first, and the hieroglyphics are also way out there. So when people painted the cave paintings, which I'm sure most of you agree with me are incredibly beautiful, sophisticated paintings, what were they painting? Animals. And sometimes there were some indications of the people, right? Not done so well, but there were people, right? Was there landscape?
It was rock.
No, no.
We have a sun.
Maybe later, like the pictographs in the Native Americans and stuff, they had the symbols, the language that they created, which goes to the kineographs. But really the emphasis wasn't on the landscape, the emphasis was on the animal, right? So why was that? Why do you suppose? Yeah, think about, like, if you were in that period of time and you were an artist, why would you paint the animals?
Show them to eat.
Right.
They were the center of their whole world.
Right.
Yeah, and religion.
Yeah, they were the power, right? That's where the food came from. They were remarkable, and that was what made you be able to just survive or not survive, right? So then we go all the way to the early Greeks and Romans before we begin to see any landscape. And the landscape we see is just on walls inside buildings. Now, if you think about, if you know anything about art history and at all, what was the major emphasis of art at the time of the Romans and the early Greeks?
Athletics were some of them.
Okay, yeah.
Body.
The body, right? I mean, we really, at that period of time, as a species, we really loved ourselves, right? And that was the most ideal thing to make art about. and also architecture. So what were those bodies like? What did they say they were?
Gods.
Perfect and gods, and were they primarily
Male.
male? They were primarily male. And so and there's some thoughts that the women ones, especially in the Greek period, look somewhat male too. And of course that developed to be much more idealized women as well as men. So those were people, and that is what they were focused on. So why did they paint sort of these wallpapery kind of things of landscape on the inside of the houses or inside of the very special places, do you suppose? No?
Like decoration. Yeah.
Yeah, decorative, and so the vision really was at that time the human and the power of being able to enclose ourselves and protect ourselves, and the decorative element was landscape because it's beautiful, right? So even early on, it was beautiful. So what happened to it as it went along? Well, I can't talk to you about the Asian paintings because then I would have you here forever. But they would be probably the next earliest in the early 4th century and stuff. There are some dynasties that have writings that describe landscape paintings, and then a little later on they have actual, it's called in the Northern Dynasty. Wait a minute, I wanted to show you this. I don't know if you can see this, but here's the inside of a building during that period, and it's in a villa in Rome, and this is the 1st century BCE. And then there was the Northern Song Dynasty, of which there still remains landscapes. And I mean, there's just so much to be said about the Asian landscape. We don't really evolve from the Asian culture, so I'm going to keep with European because that's how we think. But there's a lot to be learned in the Asian. So it went along for quite a ways after that, after the decorative elements on the side, in the inside of the Romans, before landscape was actually seen in painting. And that was in the Renaissance. So we're talking about, you know, the 13th century to the 14th century. So that's quite a big jump. And at that time, does anybody have an art historian? How was landscape used during that time? Can you tell me? Can anybody tell me?
Behind religious illustration.
Yes, right. So it, once again, decorative, right? Putting it behind. Why were they so caught up in the architecture and the people, do you suppose, during that period of time? And not so much the landscape? Who was in power at that time?
They were paid by the Pope to paint.
Right, okay. So it was religious. It was religious, and it was paid by the religious. At this time, if you look at economic scales, you have the wealthy, who are the religious, right? You have the semi sort of hanging on wealthy who can do things for those religious people, you know, kind of down a little bit lower, but pretty far above the rest of the world that is, you know, the rest of society, okay? So the dominance is religion, and Christian religion. And so those people wanted to see those stories and parables and ideas, and that's what they were paying for. But the painters, of course, worked in the landscape because we're compelled by landscape. And this is Caravaggio, and it's a good example of the Italian Renaissance. It wasn't until the end of and actually most of this, a lot of this development of landscape happens in Italy. It wasn't until the end of the Italian Renaissance that that Michelangelo was painting, and he was actually really came forward as an enthusiast of landscape. And I think anyone who's learned about him realizes that he wasn't ever really painting or sculpting what he wanted to be doing, but he loved landscape, and he really tried to give it a sense of its own power. And then there's quite a jump to the 15th century, and we get these early Dutch landscapes, okay? And they are not about religion. Now, why is that?
Farmers.
Okay.
Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, Protestants. They're Protestants. They're not interested in that religious stuff, right? But the economics change so that the Protestants become, the people that become wealthy are who? Not the priests and
The merchants.
Merchants.
the merchants. The merchants become wealthy. So they want everything that the wealthy had prior to their becoming wealthy. And one of the most random wealth things you can buy is painting. And so they were the ones that were marketing, they were the ones that were paying for people to paint, and they started to very much appreciate the landscape itself. It comes right from what was happening during the Renaissance, but just take the angels out, right? And focus on the landscape. Plus there was a certain kind of, it was an interesting thing at the beginning of the development of the Dutch wealthy, the Dutch commerce, was that here are these remarkable people who can actually take a land that is not land and make it into land. You know, really, really smart. And they go into trading and they become merchants and they make lots of money, but they still want to sort of seem pious, like they don't want to show off or be flamboyant. So what they used to do is they would embroider gold into their black outfits until it got to the point where they were just practically like, you know, wearing armor of gold. And so there was this group of artisans all along that were growing and growing along with the merchants. And so there was a ready-made group of people that were ready to take up painting and, you know, see what they could do with it. I don't want to just focus on, you know, I don't want to not bring in the French, because they did have some sense of landscape that started to become overwhelmingly landscape. They still liked the religious point of view, but they didn't go for angels and stuff like that. And they had an idea of a classical sense of painting landscape, so that there was harmony and peace in landscape. And it was a kind of meditative way of looking at it. And then they would, you know, stick some important religious architecture, or two little people doing something very pious in the picture. But they did develop a very beautiful form of landscape that needs to be considered. And this is Poussin, and he was in the 17th century in France. And this is another example of that, example of the classical style, but it's getting a little bit more, less symmetrical, less symbolic, more just really enjoying the landscape. And so that's moving into the 18th century in France. And then we finally get to the early 19th century, and we find that the French are really breaking loose. And here's an example of that, where the whole work was done, and this is probably one of the first examples of plein air painting. The first example being, you know, a study of just the clouds, you know, and just the remarkable quality of the land and the sky. And here is another French person, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, and I think many people have heard about Corot. And you can see how he's beginning to, this a little further into the 19th century, and he's beginning to do a lot of things that you see in Impressionism, breaking it down into shapes and emphasizing the structure of the land and the influence of the light and the drama behind the light and the characteristics of nature upon the land, much more realistic. And so then we run into the first plein air artists, and these are the guys by almost the mid-19th century that go out with their canvases and their boxes of paint and stuff, and they paint out in the world just for the painting itself. And I wanted to ask, why was that possible, where it hasn't been possible before? What was the initiative for that?
Transportation. Okay.
Right, right. They had, it was the arrival of the industrial age, and paints were now available in boxes. They were pre-ground and mixed, and there was availability of lighter formats like paper. Some of these are painted on paper. And there was more free time because now we're building a middle class. There was also it's also important to mention that around this time, the wealthy people now were not so much, in a large part of Europe, were not so much the priests, but they were the merchants, as we said, and they started to get to a point where they were very, very powerful and very much appreciated themselves, and decided to start to become philanthropists. Okay, so we have these major wealthy men becoming philanthropists. And so one of the things that they did was that they would choose young, budding male artists to travel through the Italian, French, Dutch, English landscapes and to tour. They sponsored them. So we're kind of getting into that area too, where there are some people who are free to paint and not worry about anything else, and they may be from wealthy families, or they may just have been exceptional in some way. But normally they have to be fairly well educated for these people to like them. And now they're getting sponsored by the wealthy merchants. And then we have the introduction in that same century, because we all know how fast things have been moving now, of photography. And this photograph right here is actually a tin plate. And in order to take those, do you remember what kind of cameras they used for those?
Huge.
They were like gigantic and heavy and awkward, and so the very devoted people that went out into the world to take these pictures of great vistas. You know, I mean, wouldn't you do that if you had that big thing? I mean, you wouldn't like go, oh, nice flower, you know? So these great vistas that were coming through in photography are now playing a large role on painting. It's exciting. The new painters are seeing it. The first of what would be considered the god painters of the Impressionists, the god painters of the plein air artist was Gustave Courbet, and he just broke loose. And he went out there and he he painted the landscape as it spoke to him. And it was savage. It was wild, but yet it was within the realm of what people could appreciate. And at the same time that he was painting this, we were developing printing of art prints. So his work could go into books, and it could go into just little prints, and it could be taken around and shown in shops and stuff. So he became incredibly well known. And now we're going into the Impressionists that were influenced by him, and this is Pissarro. And if you can see this, you see that now the person things are breaking up in the landscape more and more. Courbet had started to break things up, and now Camille Pissarro is actually kind of almost joining with the landscape in a sense that it's his vision is coming through. He's choosing, what do I paint, what do I not paint, where do I want the color, where do I want the various things, based on what will appeal to me instinctually and to myself. And then we have Claude Monet, which we all know, and this is another new phenomenon. So he's wealthy. By this time, with the religion becoming very Protestant, the people are still used to taking Sundays off. Some of them are used to taking Saturdays off. And so what is developed is this, Saturday, Sunday time off, which is the weekend. And by this time, many people are living in the cities, and especially the wealthy. That's where everything's happening. You don't really go out onto the farm in the rural areas because you can't really be part of it. And so there was a lot of going out on the weekends of the wealthy, and Monet did most of his paintings to represent that weekend love of the outdoors, which we still have today. And then I wanted to include, because I don't think many people know this, but at the same time in the United States we had Winslow Homer, who was knocking out some pretty good plein air. And then I wanted to also say that the French had gotten pretty great. This is a Renoir, and it's actually becoming it's going past landscape, and now the color is coming in as a part of the emotional feel of the landscape. And also during this time, because of the Industrial Revolution, there's the chemistry, the chemists have come forward, and now we have colors that we can paint with that are beyond the earth colors. And that is also shown here. Before, it was very hard to get these rich blues and reds and purples and colors of this,
quality.
What's the word I want for it? Can't think.
Quality.
Saturation is what I wanted. And then I wanted to point out Alfred Sisley, and here the title is Along the Woods in Spring, and it's done almost at the turn of the 19th century, and we start to see just something kind of sketchy, sort of momentary, sort of not as more fleeting in his work. And this is where we're being led to, is this kind of religion's dropping off more and more, and really the feel of the landscape is becoming part of our spiritual processing. And then, of course, that goes on to the Post-Impressionists, and here is Cezanne, and now we're really looking at deeply inside ourselves, because here he has taken the landscape and changed it into forms and colors and arrangements that are eliminating a lot of what nature is in nature. Like it's like becoming God in a way and deciding what part of nature you want to show. And really limiting it and bringing it down to just what's interesting to you and others. And then, of course, we can't go anywhere without going to Vincent van Gogh. And, of course, if you know about Vincent van Gogh, he actually came from his father was a Protestant minister, and he was not wealthy. He came from a large family. But he would wanted to be a minister, but he was really, really lousy at it. And he was always offending people wherever he went. He was maybe the first known case of Asperger's, or probably worse. And so his family, they were upright. They were situated in the middle class, and they were hoping that their children would go beyond. They had family members that had been merchants and very wealthy. And so, and they did have a family member that had made quite a bit of money in that print industry that I was talking about. And they really, like, he was so impossible to live with. He was such a challenge, a real personal thinker, and couldn't, in that Victorian period where people wanted you to conform to certain polite necessities and stuff like that, he just couldn't. And so eventually they were just willing for him to do anything. Okay, you like painting, go into painting. And his brother was his younger brother, and he was the eldest, was assigned, as being the second eldest, was assigned the duty of taking care of this very troubling brother that can't do anything. And so he had gone into that printmaking business with his uncle, and he was becoming wealthy, and he was very much involved in the development of the Impressionist art and the new art style with the real hip people that were in town, in Paris and wherever. And so he sent Vincent van Gogh money in order for him to live, and they banished him to places where they wouldn't have to have him nearby. And he just painted and painted, and at first he wanted to paint and draw like all the more of the religious type of content, and you can do that, but then he just eventually, it really was just him and the landscape. And this is true spiritual love of the landscape, and it has everything to do with him. And he also, at the same time, he had a very bad case of syphilis, and it was very advanced, and there were lots of halos and stuff like that. So he was hallucinating, he had halos in his vision, and he was very lonely, and he was finding, having to take that angst and find it in landscape. As a matter of fact, people wouldn't sit for him. He had to pay people enormous amounts of money to sit for him, or try to get another artist to have somebody sit for them and then sit in on it. And I can go on and on about Van Gogh because he's a very interesting guy. So then now we come to a period of time where it's possible for women to paint. Wow, why is that? Why can women paint all of a sudden? Georgia O'Keeffe had wealthy parents. People are becoming more liberal in the United States. And then what happens to Georgia? Who's her real? Yeah, Stieglitz. Okay, so and then there's this wealthy art dealer who's got this open mind and wants to find all this new stuff, and wow, there's this woman who paints like this. And he puts his money behind her. And off she goes into the wilderness of the United States, or first to Lake George, which really wasn't the wilderness, it was his wealthy homestead, but further on into the world with her paintings. And I would like to go back. But anyway, there were other significant female artists who came out at that time, and one was, I think I have her in here, is Emily Carr, because I really love her. But I wanted to, I guess this is here because I want you to see that also at that period of time, Americans and people in Europe are working with what is playing against the landscape. That's pretty much becoming important too. So here is a landscape, but it's primarily an old house and a railroad track. So we're beginning, people that there's this artistic, prayerful, spiritual connection to landscape, and all of a sudden the landscape is starting to disappear and get ruined. And this might be one of the first examples of being sensitive to that. The other person I wanted to talk about, the other female artist, was Emily Carr, and what happened, she tagged onto a group of artists. She also comes from a wealthy family, and this was the other thing that I wanted to point out, why women could become artists, because at some point along the way, women could inherit their father's wealth, and this is about this time. And so she and her sisters inherited the father's wealth, and she had the advantage of being challenging and unusual person, so it was very nice to get rid of her and have her go paint. And she was in British Columbia, and she was desperate about the destruction of the world, of the natural world, and of the art of the native peoples. And so that's what she wanted to do. And at that time, most people that were painting of the native peoples were using what was called a native or an Indian motif. And she thought that was pretty disgusting. She didn't want to paint like them. She wanted to document what they had done. So her work is truly amazing to go into. And then I wanted to add that photography is still going along, and I got to show you that Ansel Adams was really like on top of his game with landscape and you know, involving us in not just the vistas, but you know, the way that nature plays on trees and you know, the world around us, and you know, learning to use composition in a startling way. And then we go on, and this is Joseph Stella, and he's pretty contemporary, and we get into this area, and this happened with the Group of Seven, and with Emily Carr, and many of these other important landscape artists at the time. They actually decided they turned to landscape as a kind of religion, and they came up with something that would be called symbolism, where they actually, if I could go backwards, I could show you that Emily Carr, you know, she and Lauren Harris were very